So two of these faces you've seen already. Right next to my left there's Bastien, and he's a system engineer at Clearspace, from which you have heard before. So thanks so much for joining this panel today. And I'd like to start off this panel with looking for the right tool for the tool stack. And not so surprisingly, the first tool that we all choose is the team that we have, right? So I'm very curious to hear from you, maybe Ben. How do you make sure to pick the people with the right mindset, thinking of the function that they can provide to you and the company?
Yeah, a couple of things. I mean, one of the things about requirements or I talked about systems engineering as a whole and how we look at the whole process of tools and people, I look for people who have yearned for something different. I've been frustrated in a previous life, have seen ways in which they felt it held up their job. That doesn't mean they have the answer. It doesn't mean we can provide them immediately the answer, but it gives them that kind of aspiration that there should be something better, because that in itself is something which means you've got someone that wants to try and pursue a better way of working. And in doing so, they're open to new ideas. People that kind of look for a way because it's always worked and they understand it and they're not willing to make change means that culturally they could be the smartest person in the room, but actually you're going to have a harder journey trying to progress the overall business forward when you've got people that are clinging on to some way that they hold true to themselves that isn't best for the program.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And but when people join your teams, Federico, maybe you can say something. What do they say is different about working in your team than everything that they've been working before on?
So we have a lot of social events, so we go out a lot. That's what they say. No, but they actually, that's a very good question, because we have a wide variety of people that we hire with the mindset and mentality that Ben just shared, actually. And they all come from different backgrounds, including, larger space realities, but also outside of space. Actually, roughly 50% of a company in ispace Europe is not from a space background. So usually, depending if they come from a startup environment, which is more dynamic, more prone to change, or a larger corporate one, the key difference is that jobs and roles descriptions are not as strict in a company like ours. So your bullet points are there for formality, but you're always kind of like expected to step in a role which might not be formally yours. And if you have a skill set that can support another role, whether it be in engineering or in business, that's what we expect. That's what the company expects you to provide. And the biggest feedback is that, sometimes as an engineer, you expect to do your calculation, your analysis, provide the result, and then move on. In this case, you're expected to collaborate with different, cross-functionally, you're expected to communicate with different management and different stakeholders. So it's not really the same speed of work and the same speed of interactions. And this catches a couple of new hires a little bit early on in the process, trying to adapt to this. But oftentimes, because they're supported in this environment, they adapt and we can get to move forward.
And I think it just speaks to the fact that although I now called it a tool, this team, obviously that's exactly the opposite of what these people are, right? You expect them not to have an input-output function and do just stuff in the middle, but like do so much more. Bastien, maybe you can say something. Lots of you are building something for the first time, and I mean, you're bringing literally for the first time in a big way, I would say an ambitious way, things out of space back to the ground. What is the key challenge when you're trying to organize your team's processes and tools when you're doing something that no one has done before?
Well, there's a lot behind that question, but I think a few of the key points that held us back and had us challenged at Clearspace, and maybe to bounce back on what you said, when hiring people, what we were looking for are people who are comfortable with being uncomfortable. Because with the speed at which we grew and with the challenges of setting up all of the R&D, setting up all of the processes and the tools, which none of it existed, it meant that you had to sometimes work without the comfort of a clear process, without the comfort of a clear tool. And so the real challenge was, one, enable people that needed to work fast. Know that at the end you would, in the end, have a process, have a tool somewhere where the data could be kept. And make sure along the way that all of this work that you did prior to having everything in place was not lost, was not discarded, and could be reused afterwards. And this is something that we still struggle with, that we still have a challenge with, and that we grow at the speed of the team. And the processes and the tools usually grow slightly slower, just a little bit behind, because you realize you need something when you actually need it, and it takes some time to put in place. So I think those would be the main takeaways.
And Ben, I remember you yesterday saying, right, and also in the pause in between, that you have to find that balance, right? You have to find the balance between being very, very fast and knowing what you can be fast on. But you're building a vehicle where people are going to be sitting in. There's things that you cannot fail at, and there's times when you have to take a step back and say, no, we're going to do this right. How have tools and processes helped you make that distinction? Or once you've made that distinction, how are you using them differently?
Yeah. I should say it's probably interesting to think that you can develop your tools and processes in parallel with the design and not be scared of that either. So we talk about parallel design and serial design. You can also do parallel toolchain design. So when I think about I talked about one-way, two-way decisions. When I'm thinking about a compliance topic, I want to know from the outset the way we've configured our toolchain and our processes is going to deliver me in a form something which is usable for that purpose and doesn't have to be rewritten again, even though the information was correct. For something which is actually for our own need, and you spoke about reuse and kind of, you want to be able to have an afterlife for it, actually you've got a bit more time to make decisions. You can have a go, you can try requirements and find that the way you write them isn't very good. Because actually there is always going to be a time up to launch or after launch where you can go back and refactor that same information. You're not losing any of that integrity because of the way the versioning history was. You're just improving the quality of it in its same right. So developing the tools along the way has been a powerful thing because we've said, now you need to design, jot things down, jot it down in the tool. Don't worry too much about it because I'm not worried about the compliance side of this because it's non-compliant topics, but it is engineering assets that we need to improve. And then you look at the other side and you have to focus on those from day one.
And I remember us actually being on the phone a long time ago, and there was this question of, well, do we now have the time, right, to go like this way or go that way? And I think you made a smart decision in the end where you said, well, in the end, what matters is if we're already storing all that information now, right? If it's all gonna be connected in the future, I'm feeling fine. I can sleep better because I know we can go back. I know I have the history. I know I can create all of that traceability, which if you had Excel files floating around, you'd either have to create from scratch, which I've seen companies doing, or you'd have to basically take a whole team for a whole bunch of time just to prove that back. So the foresight of saying, even though I don't have all the answers of how I'm going to prove things later, having those things there already, I think is a smart way of looking at it without the knowledge of the future.
Just to add to that, it was intentional. If you haven't written something yet, wherever you put it, be intentional. Because you can always improve it. And that was the decision. Otherwise, you, as you say, end up having to refactor for it. And that would be a waste of energy and effort at a time when you're already up against critical deadlines.
And I'm curious, Bastien, I saw on your timeline basically that lots of that growth in your company happened during COVID times. So how has COVID shaped your view on tools and the need to collaborate if not everyone is in a normal setting?
It's kind of a tricky question for us because even before COVID, to get the talents that we needed for the mission, a lot of our team was already teleworking. There were very few people in Lausanne itself, but we had talents left and right. And so even before COVID, we tried to foster the appropriate tools and the appropriate communication for that. And when COVID hit, wasn't that much of a problem. Actually, after COVID, when we got into a stronger ramp up and having the need for more and more people to be on site because hardware is starting to get built, that's when there was a shift in that people got hired that were less exposed to teleworking or that had less of an easy time to get used to it. So we're right now working more in the sense of trying to support these different mindsets in a way.
It's very interesting to hear that aspect of it because in our experience, it was nearly the polar opposite. We really struggled. It was kind of a shock for us. We were more used to, face-to-face, kind of whiteboard type of work, workshops with the engineers, discussions face-to-face on a daily basis. And then suddenly, boom, for many months, we had to adapt. And we couldn't expect it, we couldn't foresee it, so we didn't have the right foundations in place to telework or to lead this kind of new collaboration. And this was not just on the engineering, but it was also on things like reporting or monitoring, data, or it was on many different aspects, and even things like safe distances in labs. We were building already when the pandemic hit. We were building some of our engineering models and pre-flight models of our products. So now instead of 8 technicians in a lab, you could only have 1 or 2. So we had to come up with ways to, basically cut down the scope of the activity. So we really, had a ramp-up period in the beginning, and add to that the team morale and trying to get an harmonious environment behind the screen. So that's quite insightful to hear, that other companies already had that environment, and perhaps we should have been, more preemptive and reactive on that side for us.
Can I just take that one bit further? So before I joined Volta, the previous company, it had its own server stood up for security and all the rest of it. And it, like many companies, found that accessing remote desktop type tools now to be able to remote work in from 12,000 home offices, there was a shortage of kind of being able to bring up those servers in time. One of the things that I now look back on, but it was kind of serendipitous, is that we built an ecosystem of cloud-based tools. I wouldn't ever now buy a tool that isn't cloud-based, not because I expect another pandemic, but because actually the flexibility it provides was ingrained in the way that we built the tool chain. And it just meant you could kind of go through this phase in a way that had no further impacts.
I'm curious to hear your opinions on, in this morning we heard from Joe saying that everyone should be a chief engineer. In engineering traditionally, like fostered by the space industry, but then later also now more and more in automotive, we hear about systems engineering and thinking from a systems perspective of your whole product. But systems engineering has been anything from a buzzword where people just say, I look at more than one thing, so it must be systems, all the way to the extreme of I'm drawing SysML things on a canvas, and now that's a system model. Maybe Ben, in your experience, what is for you needed from a systems engineering perspective as a mindset and ability from people, and how do you define a systems engineering approach, if any?
I really related to what Joe was saying. I mean, I think it's long since been the case that you expect the owner of a commodity or an element within a system to take the full responsibility end to end. That's how small companies function. I think coining it a chief engineer, I think, really gives it a framing, and it gives you that policy that, as he described, you need to put in place to achieve. I think for the way I see it from a systems engineering standpoint, forget the kind of the tools and the languages and how you approach it. Systems engineering starts by describing the problem. And we long since don't describe the problem anymore. We spend a lot of time coming up with the technology and then try and work out how to use it, or we have an idea in a research environment and we feel that it will fit into the next project, but we're not clear why. And you have a lot of disparate engineering that is good, but the effort is put in a place where the business is not asking for it, or maybe the customer doesn't, it doesn't solve a problem. So I think system engineering for me allows a framework where you define the problem, be it that a corporate problem, a customer problem, or a regulatory problem. I think then when you separate what you're trying to achieve in some non-engineering speak, and then focus solutions on delivering a problem, solution to that problem, then actually the design is a function of that. So however you want to break down your organization, your verticals, your whatever, you can still have siloed organizations that apply best practice and systems approach, and the product will be better for it, because I think you're solving a problem rather than just developing for developing's sake.
I think this morning you mentioned an example of a mirror to me. Maybe you can just quickly share with the audience, because I think it's a perfect example of if the solution is being described instead of the problem. That's not good. I
mean, automotive is quite behind a lot of other industries, and we are highly regulated for reasons of, we are trying to go into a uniform market and there's hundreds of thousands of vehicles on the road. We now have technologies that surpass what was always the tradition. So optical mirrors are what you use on every vehicle, but you can now, as I showed in the presentation yesterday, you can just have a piece of glass that allows you to see the ground, but the regulation states you need a mirror. It doesn't state what you need to see, it states you need a mirror. And I think that in itself can sometimes be a conflict with trying to do advancements in engineering, because you've already solved for the problem, but yet you're dictated the solution. And that's where you've got to be very careful in systems engineering, that you're not describing the solution, you're describing the problem. And regulation is falling foul of systems engineering in some cases.
Yeah, so in the end, something that could have been so simple, telling people you need to be able to look what's on the ground. you confine not only their design space, but you create extra work. And I think if there's one thing that we've learned from the talk in the morning, for example, it is that it shouldn't matter, right? It should be like the way of approaching it from a systems perspective should always be on the outcomes and what you're trying to achieve, no matter which of the methods you then in the end choose.
Just to add one more, I totally agree with what you're saying. And to us, it's even been several problems. So the idea of a system engineering and the teams in our company as a systems role is to kind of provide a glue to find out not only how to solve this problem, but also what the dependencies are functionally, intra-departmentally. So although system engineers might not be foreseen to, conduct low-level analysis, they need to know what it means, what it entails, how to perform it, so they can understand how to properly, harness the benefit, or in some cases the disbenefit, and then go on to the next problem and try to, piece together a product. So it's quite challenging because although it doesn't have a formal definition, I've seen many formal definitions, but I don't think I agree with any of them fully. I've mixed them up together maybe, but it's something that, although perhaps more abstract than a full-on analysis, role, it's still widely present and widely necessary to, the conduct of a product and the life cycle of a product, at least in our company in the last couple of years.
And Bastien, when you are a systems engineer and you're trying to describe the problem, come up with solutions, start weighing things, what's the point in time for which kind of problems do you decide, well, I guess pen and paper or Excel sheets are a good tool for that? And when is the threshold when you say that kind of problem we should probably approach in a tool-based way?
Maybe to start answering that question, I'm going to bounce back on the definition of the systems engineer, because one aspect that I think is important that was touched on, I think, by Joe Justice this morning, on what the role of a system engineer is. You can scope it different ways, more or less on product definition or different things. But one of the things that I think is important is that the systems engineer, in a way, needs to be a good listener with respect to what every engineer that's working on an analysis or something lower down is doing. Because in the end, where you give the most value as a system engineer is if you can try to educate everybody on the bigger picture view. That's how you get then the most benefit from everybody. So you need to be a good listener. And when it comes to, okay, do I need a tool or do I need to do this in Excel? In a way, I just have to listen to the engineers. If I ask them, hey, you need to do this analysis, we need to figure this out, and they come back to me in saying that I know Valispace, but it was quicker to do it in Excel. Now I know it's either because it was actually quicker for them to do it in Excel, or that there's a flaw in training where they don't understand the tool, or there's just a flaw in the implementation that we've done of it. So this decision of, do I do this in Excel or do I do this in a dedicated tool, is kind of most of the time self-explanatory. But what I'd like to do is push it to be more and more obvious that it just goes in the tool. Right. And in that, breaking the barriers to entering this data, I think is something that the person representing Duro yesterday in the panel also talked about. And I very much believe in that as well.
Yeah, at Valispace, we like to sometimes look at engineering data as a pyramid, and at the basis of it, you have to first have data, actually. So you cannot just have documents and so on. That's not something that you can build something on top. It's the foundation. And then on top, you can build insights and you can build optimization and processes. Ben, how do you think about that? When do you still have to push people to make sure that the foundation is right? And when do you feel that pull where people are getting happy of being able to get all those upper level benefits out of it?
Yeah, I mean, I really relate to what you're saying. I think the pleasing moment for me is when someone comes along and says, I've got a problem I want to solve. How would I do that in that tool? Because they've had that moment on their own without having to then say, why did you do it there or did it there? And actually, if they do something out of the tool and it's a one-time thing, then you say, that's okay. If you find them doing it repetitively, you might say there might be a better way and try and coach them back into it. Or if they come and do it in the tool, but they do it ineffectively, then you can always then, as back to my point, if it's not critical path compliance or some other function that is going to cause you a delay, then you've got time to help them understand the power and the maturity, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The human factors of this is really an important thing. If I've used a number of tools, some are industry leading, arguably speaking, and I can't get an engineer to open the tool. You know, they don't want to open it, they don't want to interface with it, it's a burden on their job. They understand why they need to use it, but they don't want to use it. Getting the other side of that, where someone sees it as the place that they spend their time instead of opening Outlook or whatever it is, you know, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So it mustn't slow you down, but it must end with the result you were expecting.
And maybe a question to any of you, like, do you have like an anecdote, a moment in time where you say like, okay, that was a moment where you saw like aha moments in your team, and where you saw that this propelled our team, this propelled the people, and you saw people empowered by the way you've set up process and tools?
We have quite a few examples. I'm thinking of the best one perhaps, but one really, let's say, close to me, one really good one close to me is when what I showed yesterday is kind of like the tool chain from, in one click, from requirements down to product sizing. So the actual mission and product sizing. The moment that, you know, we first demoed this to the people involved, management, even, you know, company management beyond Europe, and it worked, first of all, and it provided results which usually took weeks to generate in just, you know, a few minutes. That really kind of like clicked, you know, a switch. So for some of us which were involved with the tool development and were involved with this work, we knew it was a long time coming, and we knew it was time to shift the company mindset. But for many, you could just see in the room a palpable difference. You could tell that, you know, their eyes were, okay, so we could have done this a long time ago. How do we not invest the time and resources, you know, in the past? If this can work, imagine how many more things can work. For example, ERP software for kind of like stock control for hardware procurements. That's another example that we recently, you know, had a eureka moment that you can basically control much more efficiently. So I don't think there's a single moment. It's a successful team will have many of these moments if they're flexible enough to change and flexible to try these tools in the years to come. So, and I'm looking forward to the next ones that I can't imagine today, you know, but in the next months and years will be coming up.
So it's all about seeing it in action somehow, right? Like it's the practicality of more than the theory, having that moment when something that you thought by definition had to take weeks suddenly is faster. Yesterday in the panel that we had here, we talked a bit about tool stacks and tool chains, right? It's not only about like individual parts, and you showed also on the slides how you're connecting some things yourself. So maybe a question, Ben, how much do you expect to be connected by default, and how much do you think it's also maybe your IP or your way of working that you want to be able to do things that others don't? Like, is that something that you consider, like, do you consider process part of your IP on that level? Or do you think if we just got the best of breed everywhere and everyone would be like working like this, we would all benefit?
Yeah, I think it's split into two parts. I think the blueprinting was a fascinating example of this. I think if you're very clear on what is your IP and why it can make you go faster, then you probably don't want a one-size-fits-all solution. And if you made a tool that could do that, then I think people would deviate from it to find another, you know, local improvement over the top. I think there are other activities where it's very transactional. If you have to develop transactional relationships, then that's not very good for your core product. You didn't go into engineering to create an interface, but sometimes you need to interface faster because you can automate versus manual. If the tools can be more compatible and or build upon that, then that is something I think you would want a single solution for. Whereas when I think about how we run our programs, we don't run gateways. We don't run kind of stop events, because if you're not prepared to stop, don't call it a gateway. What we run a kind of continuous deployment of integration. The tool chain we built for that using the Bastien product, I should say, I would say is part of our IP, because it's how the culture of our organization runs. It's how we on a daily basis from a management side work out what's on or off track without bothering the engineering community, or how the engineering community do their day job, prioritize, but are giving information without realizing it. And it's that continuous kind of snapshot framework which it isn't a tool, it's an ecosystem, but we own that ecosystem and we've selected the tools we wanted to drop into it. So no, I think for things that are going to make you have a competitive edge, it is something you have to design, just like you design the product. For stuff that I just want to work, two tools talking, I shouldn't have to design that.
It's true because, I mean, most of us would have access to the tools, but the way they interact and we work with the tools, it would be different depending on the scope and the company. So I agree with you when you say, you know, it's kind of our IP, the way the process has been defined and designed. That's, you know, depending on which function you're in, maybe engineering or management, the way that this information flow happens is something that is very unique and tailored to either you're talking about in a program scale or in a company scale. In our case, yes, we're very strong on Atlassian products as well. And they are ever so powerful, but it's the way you use them. It's the way that you can harness what they can offer. And you can, like you were mentioning, and you can convince, you know, and basically persuade the rest of the team and teach and onboard the rest of the team on using these. That's where the real benefit comes from. Because if only a very small silo in the company uses it and harnesses its benefit, it doesn't spread, it doesn't disseminate the benefit. So it's a, you know, long-term, I kind of mentioned the word patience yesterday. It's a long-term, you know, sometimes excruciating process, but the end results are very good for the entirety of the team, in our case.
And Bastien, when you decide to go on and go away from pen and paper for certain things and pick a tool, what's on your mind, right? Like, how do you know if a tool is gonna help you or suck your time?
The criteria to decide whether to go for a tool or not, when you're pressed by time, sometimes if you ask me the question, I would answer with, I need a tool that can do this, and I would list the nice. It needs to be scalable, it needs to be able to be configured, it needs to be secured, it needs to be performant. At the end of the day, the reason why you onboard a tool is always because you had an opportunity to, at least on our side, you had an opportunity to try it in something that resembles its final use case, and you saw a benefit. And the reason why you try to start with is because it looks nice, because it has a nice interface, or because it has been recommended by someone. But once you have done that test and you figure out, okay, is this going to work or not, then you can go a little bit further.
And how do you encourage this? I mean, we heard this a lot, right? It's not about making master plans. It's about trying, seeing for yourself. Like, how do you encourage people to like go try and see new things?
Well, in a way, it happens organically because we have people that need to do work and they don't have the tools. So a lot of the Valispace was a tool recommendation bottom up from an employee that knew about it. And that was like, oh, I need to log this information. Right now, I don't know where I'm going. I know of this thing. Let me recommend it. We did a test. We liked it. So I think for a lot of that, we rely, the same way you rely on your engineers to be chief engineers for the design, you should also let them feed in your process. And I think in practice, to bounce back on what you said, you will need at some point to have the flexibility, even in the same company as Clearspace, to provide for an institutional mission where sometimes the processes are very much dictated, and more agile things, because you have these things running in parallel. But you don't want to maintain two different tools that describe the same technology. So I think the flexibility on how you configure the tool and how you use it is really desirable. It's kind of what I think we should strive for, at least from the point of view of Clearspace.
And Ben, if I remember your graph from yesterday of the ramp up of people that you have and having experienced it like at least secondhand, how have tools been also something that help onboarding? Like, how you have a new employee, they don't know anything about the trucks that you build. Is there a place for tools and for the data in a easily consumable way to like shorten that time and have people up to speed very fast?
The truth of the matter is, I don't think what we do today works. So we're in the midst of trying to take a body of evidence and now deploy it for onboarding better, because we've recognized the speed we've onboarded, we neglected to consider those people coming in and their uptime. it just overtook us amongst everything else. So we're right in the middle of a phase now where we're refactoring everything. We've got too many ways of accessing the data. We've got too many ways of navigating through getting to a particular dashboard or a particular space where information is. Even if it's a single source of truth, we might have it synced in multiple places. And so what we're going back to is the basics of what is your role function? What is it that your views are of the business, whether you're in kind of, engineering or for information or marketing, whatever it might be. And we're realizing that actually we don't use the data effectively, even though the data is good. And that's a challenge in itself, is to then say, as a new starter, how do I quickly navigate to the single source of truth that is human intelligible, not the design? And so, in hindsight, that would have been factored in from the beginning, but we focused more on just bringing up the tool chain to allow the engineers to do their jobs. Now we're seeing the downstream ripple effect of that, which is it's not as usable as we'd like, but at least we've got it. We can now build upon that in kind of monthly sprints to build a better way of onboarding. So today, I don't think we do it very well, if I'm honest.
And then maybe last question from me before I open up to the audience so you can start thinking of your questions. Federico, what kind of, like, if you imagine a bit into the future, how tools should help, what do you wish for? Like, what does your engineering workday with tools look like 5 years from now, if everything goes well in this world?
Oof. So I agree very strongly what you mentioned about the flexibility, because even if a tool is not perfect or doesn't solve every single requirement or every single thing we're looking for, if it's flexible enough to be adapted to what we're trying to work on, we will be attracted to it. So we will be attracted to basically working with it. And in the future, I basically expect our company to collaborate with more of these highly flexible and highly responsive tools, which take a little bit of a burden away from the engineers to ramp up on them and to create any compatibility, scripts or compatibility means to make the tools work together. So there's the tools and the tool chain. So you can be onboarded on a tool, but still not understand the tool chain. Or you can be onboarded on the tool chain and know all of them at a high level and not know how to use each one by one. So this kind of, gap in the understanding, I think will be diminishing with time. And in the space industry, there's a lot of, in this market, there's a lot coming up right now in terms of speed and while retaining the quality, because of course, if we go faster, we need to make sure we're so certifiable, the products are, complying to the standards. So at least in my case, I look forward to seeing tools which are ever so flexible, but also allowing for more complex, more convoluted tool chains to come together and solve bigger problems than just, maybe an engineering department or an engineering function. Beyond that as well, like the entire product life cycle and the entire product, facility. So that's at least my dream. So I hope that happens over time. Otherwise, we'll find a way.
Any questions from the audience for our panelists?
So I think it's great to talk about tools. Where are places where you found, if any, where the right tool was no tool, where you've deleted a tool and the lack of a tool actually made a better outcome? Have you found any of those?
If I can maybe begin, something as simple as meetings or something as simple as, sharing information. Often there's many things that, you can track whatever is talked about. You can monitor all of the talking points. At least in our case, maybe it's due to the scale of a company or scope of a company, but we found that's quite overkill. Usually, face-to-face conversations or, ad hoc meetings or white papers. I don't know if some of you have had experiences with these in the past, just one snapshot of a page, are much more effective, much less time consuming, and much more rapid ways to converge to a solution. Another one which for us has been useful is, I mentioned in the very beginning, whiteboarding. We've tried also throughout the pandemic to come up with alternative ways to basically collaborate and just be in front of a clear, empty space so that we can jot down some ideas and brainstorm any solution to this problem. But really, we found out that you cannot replace, just constructive criticism and debating, face-to-face with an engineer, or, during the pandemic, it was through these digital tools. But you need the discomfort. Sometimes you need to have these conversations and without hiding behind the tool, which allows you to be maybe a little bit more static, but a bit more protected. So whatever comes along with, the human interaction, so communications, meetings, we found that, perhaps due to the company size, but we found that it's much better to be organic, so more human on that side.
Sorry, can I just add to that? So we didn't delete a tool. We reconsidered how we used the tool in the process. We, perhaps born out of my own desire, I tried to introduce to the business requirements formally too high up the chain. And I was adamant it was the right thing to do. And what I did was stifle the discussion. So we didn't remove, in this case, Valispace. We just lowered where the entry point to it was. So what we did is we removed the tool for that purpose. And we went back to saying wherever you want, be it an email, be it a meeting, be it a PowerPoint. It doesn't really matter. Store it wherever you want, because it's not engineering speak. It's just the discussion that got us to something lower down that we agreed we would deliver. Then we sucked it in later on. So I don't know if that sort of answers your question, but I think there are times when you can use the right tool and think you're doing it for the right reasons, and actually you constrain the speed at which the business is traveling, and you have to accept that and go back and undo things rather than just keep going forward.
Hi, great talk. I'm seeing, and I think all of us are seeing, a market pressure to get hardware products out to production much faster than it was more acceptable in the past, not too long ago. I'm curious how that trickles down to your teams for how long you're willing to wait to procure a tool and for it to become productive in your teams. Is there pressure to, like, if we can't get this working with a certain time period, let's rip it out? Or is it, let's just continue pressing on until we actually get it to work and teams are productive?
I don't mind having a go. I mean, I think it depends. Some tools you cannot function without. You cannot manage a bill of materials in Excel when you get to thousands of parts with multiple complexity. So some things you have to start, you have to know and have the right experience to know how to deploy it on time. And if it's a rough ride, you have to see it through, because the fallback is not an option in itself. Then there are other examples where I think, and it takes kind of a vision that you are pursuing, where we took some of the things we designed in-house, our harnesses, which, 5 kilometers of harnessing linked to geometric CADs and all the functions that have delivered out of the systems engineering process, which was happening in parallel. We knew that if we had a 2-year program and you've got typical lead times of 6 to 9 months from release, then you have to have a better way. So those were nice to haves, but we could always fall back into a more manual way if it was causing us a delay. But when we landed it, it took months out of the cycle, because data was available at point of release, which can be built upon the next week. So for me, I think picking ones you have to commit to, they're my one-way decisions, and then everything else is a two-way, but just know that you're trying to improve it and drop out back into manual if you have to. But drop out when there's still time to succeed. Don't hold too long on your course and then find that the failure is that you failed to make the decision to go back to manual at the right time.
To add on to that as well, we talked about the criteria to select a tool before, like the benchmarks. And in our case, something like, as simple as technical support or customer service is something that we look into. Why? Because if we really struggle with a tool, but we know there is the benefits and we know we can harness the benefit from a tool, we don't give up on it straight away. We might be de-scoping a little bit the size of the activity, or de-scoping who's working on it full-time or part-time. But we keep pushing until we realize that, perhaps it's not the right time or it's not the right project phase. But while we select, potential candidates, we take into account the reaction time. So basically the support that we can get from the company themselves to help us if we get stuck, if we have any blockers along the way. Oftentimes this has been, with Valispace is a clear example. We've had, several exchanges, and they've been solved very rapidly. Other tools as well, we've had issues with compatibility and they've been solved quickly. So to us, we don't take it as a, instant failure and instantly shut down the attempt, but rather we try and collaborate with providers themselves. And we've been lucky so far, to work with very good professional companies. So I can't bring a bad example, but by selecting early on a company which you can trust, you can communicate to, usually you will be able to cut down this risk later on down the line.
Which is how it comes back to people again. We always, every time you talk about something technical, it seems to sneak back up on us that it's not all about the technical parts. I have a last question to close this panel, and it's for all of you. I said yesterday that we found that 86% of the time of engineers are used for non-engineering work. We heard today from Kiwook that they're working in the next, I think, 3-year time frame to reduce their engineering hours or time spent on the same things by half. How much do you think is there potential being engineers, and it might hurt us because it's what we do on a daily basis, but when you think realistically over the next few years, how much more efficient do you think you can get your own engineering teams if you get processes and tools in place that remove all the barriers of things that are not necessary? Maybe starting with you.
For us at Clearspace, it's difficult because it's not only processes and tools, it's also the scope of what you're doing, your external stakeholders, how you're managing a program overall. All of that has an impact. But if we talk solely on what is the focus of like what tools and processes can add, they can just cut down on, in practice, it's extremely difficult to answer that question, I think, because it's very specific. If we talk about the institutional mission that we're doing, tools and processes are there, but they're gonna have an incremental benefit to what we're doing.
And once you unleash, basically, we saw the slide on like the move to the right, where you want to basically unleash all the potential.
Then that becomes much more, it's how your benefit depends on how much of your time anyway is focused on processes that you can't cut down on.
In our case, I believe it will start much earlier on in the process. So right on from the even hiring stages and then onboarding stages, because now a lot of these foundations and tools and tool chains are in place within engineering and outside, but we are not doing a good job yet at making everyone aware and making everyone up to speed with them. So we need to begin much earlier on in the process to make sure that everybody is sharing the same environment. But at the same time, it will not stop here, because just like Ben said, accepting that we have a perfect tool today or tool chain today is a mistake. We will always continue to search if there is a better alternative or a better way to collate all of these different activities together. And there will be, the company now has recognized that will be a very highly beneficial and high value activity that we'll continue doing within Europe, Japan, etc. So we just need to, once again, we need to have the people in the loop as soon as possible so that we can get these benefits sooner rather than later.
My answer, you're not going to like my answer, Marco. I don't think I subscribe to the 86% personally. Joe talked about a chief engineer. A chief engineer means you're everything. You're purchasing, your quality, your manufacturing. So what is engineering? If your job is to get something delivered, whatever the scope of that, then there are activities that are beyond just sitting crunching numbers. So you either want someone to do the absolute, or you want someone to deliver something. And I think engineering has become much more integrated and complex. I forget the source, but there's an argument for 1, 10, 100. So 1 times the effort to design at the right time, 10 times if you find an issue that was missed during the design phase, and then 100 if you're trying to catch it during production launch. And I think for me, tools and the use of and the kind of where you should put the focus is about lefting that risk. If you can left the risk to the point when the decision was being made such that you make less of those failures and have those 1, 10, 100 problems downstream, then yeah, you might take a bit of an overhead. But that overhead has just saved the program in a way that you can't calculate. We don't talk in missed opportunities. We only talk in overhead, because we can calculate overhead. But IT are the most unloved company in the business because no one talks about when it works. They only describe when it doesn't. And we mustn't forget that some of this is about just taking risk out of the program. And that in and of itself is delivering the solution in whatever your tactics were for your overall strategy.
It's really hard to count the number of mistakes that you didn't make. So probably the survival of the fittest companies that manage to get that risk out and to deliver products fast will tell at the very end. Thank you so much for being with me on this panel, and thank you very much.